My name is Emily Carter and I am 30 years old. My mother-in-law poured boiling oil over me because dinner was 5 minutes late. As the pain consumed me, I collapsed onto the kitchen floor. At the hospital, I heard my husband calmly tell the doctor, "She's always been clumsy." She spilled hot soup on herself. I stayed silent behind the curtain until the doctor leaned close and whispered, "The police are already downstairs." The agonizing liquid fire chewed through my skin with a ravenous, inescapable hunger. It was a blinding, white-hot pain that instantly swallowed every ounce of oxygen in the sprawling, marble-clad kitchen. The sound of the boiling rendered duck fat hitting my flesh was a wet, horrific hiss that will echo in the darkest corridors of my memory for the rest of my life. I collapsed onto the imported Italian tile, my throat tearing as a primal, guttural scream ripped through my vocal cords. Standing over me, her posture rigid with an archaic, monstrous sense of righteous discipline, was my mother-in-law Vivian. She held the heavy black cast-iron pot loosely in her right hand. The remaining droplets of boiling grease dripped slowly from the rim, splattering onto the floor inches from my convulsing face. Her face was not a mask of horror or accidental shock. It was twisted into a grotesque, serene mask of sadistic satisfaction. "Next time, Clara," Vivian hissed, her voice vibrating with venomous ancient cruelty. "You will ensure that dinner is plated and served the exact moment my son walks through that door. You are a wife, not a guest." My vision blurred, the edges of the room turning a sickening, fuzzy gray as neurogenic shock began to set in. My left shoulder, my collarbone, and the side of my neck felt as though they were actively being digested by 1,000 acidic teeth. I gasped for air, clutching at the floor, begging silently for help. Through the haze of my agony, I heard the heavy oak front door click shut. Footsteps echoed down the hallway. My husband Daniel stepped into the kitchen. He was impeccably dressed, as always, wearing a bespoke, charcoal gray Tom Ford suit that cost more than most people earned in a year. I looked up at him, my vision swimming with tears and blinding pain, expecting the man who had vowed to protect me to drop his briefcase, to scream to call 911. Instead, Daniel paused. He looked down at my writhing body, then up at his mother holding the cast-iron pot. He didn't rush to my side. He didn't pull out his phone. He stepped carefully over my legs. As he did, he noticed a single, microscopic drop of grease that had splattered onto the toe of his pristine, polished Italian leather loafer. He let out a long, irritated sigh. He reached for a linen napkin off the kitchen island, meticulously wiped the oil from his shoe and checked his Rolex. "Call an ambulance, Mother," Daniel said, his voice entirely devoid of human empathy, sounding as though he were asking her to take out the recycling. "Tell them it was a cooking accident. And make it quick. I have a conference call in 20 minutes. As the world finally, mercifully tilted into darkness, a single, crystal-clear thought pierced the fog of my dying consciousness. They think they have broken me. They have no idea what they just unleashed. Hours later, swimming in a thick, synthetic haze of intravenous morphine and localized agony, I slowly regained consciousness. I was lying behind the sterile, pale blue privacy curtains of the regional hospital's elite burn unit. The rhythmic, mechanical beeping of the cardiac monitor was the only sound anchoring me to reality. I kept my eyes closed. My breathing remained shallow and even. Just beyond the thin curtain, I could hear them spinning their narrative to the attending physician. "She's always been incredibly clumsy, Doctor," Daniel was saying. His voice was smooth, practiced, and dripping with the perfect modulation of a concerned, devastated husband. It was a masterclass in covert sociopathic gaslighting. "She has these dizzy spells." She was moving a heavy bowl of boiling soup from the stove. Lost her footing and it spilled all over her. "It was horrifying," Vivian chimed in, letting out a sickening, theatrical, wet sob. "My poor daughter-in-law. I tried to catch the pot. I really did, but it was too heavy. Oh God, her beautiful skin. Please tell me she won't need grafts. For 3 excruciating years, they had suffocated me. Daniel had systematically isolated me from my peers, intercepted my personal mail, gaslit me into doubting my own memory, and treated me like an unstable, slow-witted, heavily sedated bank account. Vivian had moved into the guest wing 6 months after our wedding, acting as the warden of my gilded cage, subjecting me to daily, escalating psychological and physical microaggressions. They looked at my quiet demeanor, my supposed submissiveness, and my willingness to stay home, and they assumed I was a broken bird. They forgot who I was before Daniel convinced me to leave public life to focus on our family. I was not a helpless, naive heiress. Before my marriage, I was a senior partner at a ruthless corporate law firm. I was a financial fraud attorney who specialized in dismantling offshore syndicates, uncovering hidden assets, and putting white-collar criminals in federal prison. I didn't stop being a predator. I simply went into deep camouflage. They thought the stack of dense legal documents they had practically forced me to sign. Under duress 6 months ago gave Daniel Total irrevocable control over my late father's multi-million-dollar holding company. They thought they had finally siphoned the marrow from my bones. They didn't know that I had used sleight of hand to swap the signature, pages with nullified, legally void drafts before the notary arrived. They didn't know about the offshore bank vault containing the real trust documents. They didn't know that I had spent the last 3 years silently, meticulously weaving a financial and legal web so complex and devastating that it would take a team of forensic accountants a decade to untangle. And most importantly, they didn't know the identity of the attending physician standing on the other side of the curtain. The curtain swept back on silent metal rings. Dr. Lena Ortiz stepped into my line of sight. To Daniel and Vivian, she was just the chief of trauma surgery. To me, she was my former college roommate, my fiercest friend, and the emergency legal and medical proxy I had secretly designated 2 years ago. Lena leaned over me, her stethoscope pressing against my unburned collarbone. I opened my eyes a fraction of an inch. I twitched my index and middle fingers twice. Against the hospital bedsheet, our prearranged silent signal. The trap is armed. Drop the walls. Dr. Ortiz stood up perfectly straight. She turned to face Daniel and Vivian, who were standing at the foot of my bed, wiping away their crocodile tears. Lena slipped her hands into the pockets of her white coat. The empathetic bedside manner vanished instantly, replaced by a lethal, authoritative pitch that commanded the room. "Before the officers come up," Dr. Ortiz said calmly, staring dead into Daniel's eyes. Daniel blinked, his perfect, sympathetic mask slipping a fraction of an inch. "I'm sorry, officers." "What officers?" "I told you this was an accident." "That's strange," Lena continued, her voice turning to ice. "Because the splash pattern of these second and third degree burns does not indicate a vertical spill from a loss of footing. It indicates a horizontal, aggressive projection of liquid. And the police are already downstairs in the lobby," Vivian gasped, taking a step backward. Lena didn't break eye contact with my husband. "Before they come up into this unit, Daniel, I highly suggest you prepare a very good explanation as to why your wife had a motion-activated, high-definition hidden camera actively recording inside her kitchen smoke detector." Daniel's polished, untouchable veneer shattered so violently I could almost hear the glass breaking in the sterile room. He stumbled backward, his bespoke shoes squeaking against the linoleum. His hand blindly reached out, grabbing the edge of the privacy curtain, ripping it open in a blind, breathless panic. He locked eyes with me. My eyes were wide open now, cold, alert, and entirely devoid of fear. Just as his brain struggled to process the reality of his doom, the heavy double doors of the burn unit swung open. Two large, uniformed police officers and a plainclothes lead detective stepped into the room, carrying a ruggedized police laptop that contained the high-definition, undeniable, uploaded proof of his mother's monstrosity and his own sociopathic complicity. The air in the hospital room turned to a suffocating static vacuum. The rhythmic beep-beep-beep of my cardiac monitor was the only sound that dared to break the absolute, terrifying silence as the three officers stepped up to the foot of my bed. The lead detective, a man with tired eyes and a badge that read Russo, looked at my bandaged, blistered shoulder, then turned his gaze slowly toward my husband and mother-in-law. "Officers, please. There's been a massive misunderstanding here," Daniel stammered. His voice was pitched an octave higher than usual. He raised his hands, palms outward, desperately attempting to summon the charismatic, manipulative charm that usually bent bank tellers, board members, and naive socialites to his will. He forced a frantic, condescending chuckle. "My wife, Clara, is under immense psychiatric distress. She has been for months. She's prone to extreme paranoia and delusions. She's heavily medicated. There is no hidden camera in our house. That's a paranoid fantasy. This doctor is overstepping her bounds." Vivian, recovering quickly from her initial shock, immediately seized upon her son's narrative. She clutched her pearls, her face contorting back into the mask of a grieving, terrified matriarch. "It's true, officer," Vivian wept, pointing a trembling finger at me. "She's been threatening to hurt herself for weeks. She poured that oil on herself to frame us. We have been trying to get her psychiatric help. She's a danger to herself." Detective Russo didn't blink. He didn't write anything down in his notepad. He simply looked at them with the profound, exhausted disgust of a man who dealt with liars for a living. He walked past Daniel, completely ignoring him, and placed the ruggedized police laptop onto the rolling tray table at the foot of my bed. He turned the screen so that it faced Daniel and Vivian. "Save the psychiatric evaluation for the judge, Mr. Vance," Russo said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He reached out and hit the space bar. The video began to play. I had installed the microscopic lens inside the casing of the kitchen smoke detector a year ago, hardwiring it to a continuous power source and linking it to an encrypted, off-site cloud server that uploaded data in real time. The angle captured the entire kitchen island and the stove. 4K color, complete with high-fidelity audio. There was the kitchen. There was Vivian, lifting the heavy, black cast-iron pot of boiling oil from the stove. There was her face, twisted in a snarl of archaic malice. "Next time, Clara, you will ensure that dinner is plated and served the exact moment my son walks through that door." The audio played through the laptop speakers, echoing off the sterile walls of the hospital room. There was the violent, deliberate shove of the pot, the splash of the boiling liquid, my agonizing guttural scream, my collapse onto the floor, and then, the most damning piece of evidence of all. The footage showed Daniel walking into the room. It showed him looking at his wife, screaming in agony on the floor. It showed him stepping casually over my burning body. It zoomed in, capturing the exact moment he grabbed a linen napkin, wiped the microscopic drop of grease from his expensive shoe, checked his Rolex, and ordered his mother to lie to the paramedics. The video ended, freezing on the image of Daniel wiping his shoe. The silence in the room returned, heavier and darker than before. Vivian's performative tears instantly, miraculously dried up. The facade of the weeping mother-in-law disintegrated, replaced by an ugly, feral, panicked rage. A cornered rat will always bare its teeth. "She disrespected me!" Vivian shrieked, her voice cracking into a hysterical, screeching pitch. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger at my hospital bed. "You don't understand. She is lazy. She is arrogant. She needed to be taught a lesson in respect. You can't arrest me for disciplining my own household. I am the matriarch of that home. Ma'am, turn around and place your hands behind your back," Detective Russo commanded, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. "Don't you touch me!" Vivian screamed, violently slapping at the officer's hands as he stepped forward. "Daniel, do something! Call our lawyers!" It took both uniformed officers to subdue her. They forced her face first against the sterile white wall of the hospital room, wrestling her arms behind her back. The sharp, metallic ratcheting sound of the handcuffs clicking shut was the most beautiful symphony I had ever heard. "Vivian Vance, you are under arrest for aggravated assault with a deadly weapon and battery causing severe bodily harm," Russo recited over her hysterical screaming. Russo then turned slowly to Daniel. My husband's face had turned the color of wet gray ash. He was trembling so violently his bespoke suit seemed to vibrate. The reality of his situation, the undeniable, inescapable visual, proof of his sociopathy, had finally breached the walls of his narcissism. "And you, sir," Russo said, stepping into Daniel's personal space, pulling a second pair of handcuffs. "You are under arrest for accessory after the fact to aggravated assault, filing a false police report, and reckless endangerment of a vulnerable adult. Hands behind your back." Daniel didn't fight. His arms went limp as the cold steel clicked around his wrists, locking him into a nightmare he could not manipulate his way out of. He slowly lifted his head. He locked eyes with me. His chest heaved with frantic, shallow breaths. He saw the cold, sterile detachment in my gaze. He realized in that moment that I had never been the clumsy, broken wife he thought he was molding. I was the architect of his demise. "Clara, please," Daniel whimpered, a pathetic, high-pitched plea escaping his lips. "Clara, you know I love you. Please tell them to stop. Tell them we can handle this privately." I didn't yell. I didn't curse him. I didn't offer him the satisfaction of an emotional reaction. I simply blinked, slowly and deliberately. I lay completely still among the pillows, letting the heavy, suffocating silence of the room crush him. My silence was the loudest, most absolute condemnation possible. I let the law do my talking. As the officers grabbed them by the arms, dragging a screaming, thrashing Vivian and a weeping, broken Daniel out of the burn unit and down the hallway, Dr. Ortiz stepped forward. She checked my vitals on the monitor, her face grave, before leaning down near my ear with a fierce, grim, protective smile. "The physical threat is gone." "Clara, you're safe," Lena whispered, her voice tight with adrenaline. "But Julian just called the nurses' station on the secure line." I turned my head slightly, ignoring the searing pain in my neck. Julian Vance was my lead trustee, my oldest confidant, and the senior partner at my former law firm. What happened? I rasped, my throat raw. Julian said Daniel's business partners, completely unaware of the arrest that just occurred, just attempted to initiate a hostile takeover of your family's investment firm, Lena relayed. They presented the forged documents to the bank an hour ago to secure the massive logistics loan. A cold, terrifying thrill shot through my veins, temporarily overriding the morphine. "It's time, Clara," Lena whispered. "It's time to trigger the financial kill switch." The pain medication dulled the raging fire in my shoulder to a heavy, throbbing ache. But my mind was sharper than a surgical scalpel, propped up on 3 thick hospital pillows, wrapped in sterile white gauze. I balanced a secure, encrypted tablet on my lap. The screen was divided into a secure video conference grid. On one side was Julian Vance, sitting in the sprawling, glass-walled boardroom of my father's investment firm in downtown Chicago. On the other side were three of the most ruthless, aggressive corporate litigators in the Midwest. I wasn't a domestic abuse victim crying in a hospital bed. I was the CEO operating from a mobile command center. "Walk me through the timeline, Julian," I ordered, my voice raspy but carrying an undeniable lethal authority. Julian leaned into the camera. At 9 a.m., Daniel's partners at Vanguard Logistics approached, the primary commercial lenders at Chase and Goldman Sachs. As we predicted, Daniel's Logistics company has been hemorrhaging cash for 6 months due to gross mismanagement. They are drowning in debt. I nodded slowly. I had known this for a year. Daniel had spent his company's capital funding his lavish lifestyle, assuming my family's wealth would eventually serve as an endless bailout fund. They attempted to secure a $50 million bridge loan to keep Vanguard Logistics afloat. Julian continued, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of the trap. To secure a loan of that magnitude, they needed massive collateral. They presented the holding company transfer documents. The documents you signed 6 months ago, giving Daniel executive control over your father's entire $300 million portfolio. They assumed his signature authorization was ironclad, and they pledged your family's real estate assets as the guarantee for the $50 million. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, savoring the absolute staggering hubris of my husband. 6 months ago, Daniel and Vivian had cornered me in the study. They had emotionally battered me for hours, threatening to have me committed to a psychiatric facility if I didn't sign the power of attorney and asset transfer documents, surrendering my inheritance to him. They thought they had worn me down into a submissive weeping shell. What they didn't know was that I had spent the prior 3 nights awake in the dark, meticulously drafting a legally binding microscopic addendum, using sleight of hand during the signing process, surrounded by a notary Daniel had hired. I had swapped the signature pages, the documents Daniel had locked in his safe, the documents he had proudly presented to his partners and his banks contained a hidden clause. It explicitly stated that the transfer of assets was entirely contingent upon Clara, Vance's continued physical safety, and that any attempt to utilize the assets as collateral for Vanguard Logistics without my direct secondary in-person authorization would render the entire transfer null and void, constituting criminal financial fraud. Release the nullification documents from the offshore vault to the federal regulators immediately, I ordered softly, staring into the camera lens. Send the certified copies to the compliance departments at Chase and Goldman. Already prepped, Julian smiled, typing on his keyboard. And Julian, I added, my voice dropping to a whisper of pure, concentrated venom, notify the primary lenders that Daniel Vance explicitly secured those loans using fabricated, fraudulent collateral. Inform them that the CEO of Vanguard Logistics has just been arrested for a violent felony. The execution was swift, brutal, and entirely merciless. When you lie to a bank to secure $50 million, you do not just commit a crime. You declare war on an entity that possesses more power than the government. When my lawyers notified the banks of the fraud, backed by the undeniable proof of the nullification clause in the police report of Daniel's arrest, the dominoes fell with terrifying, catastrophic speed. Within 24 hours, the financial world of Daniel Vance was utterly obliterated. The banks, realizing they were exposed to a massive fraud scandal, immediately invoked the acceleration clauses on every single existing line of credit. Vanguard Logistics held. They called in all outstanding debts simultaneously. Because Daniel, believing he was invincible and backed by my hundreds of millions, had over-leveraged his entire logistics company, he had put up his own personal remaining assets as collateral to float the business. His bank accounts, his stock portfolios, and the deed to the McMansion Vivian lived in were all tied to the company's debt. My legal maneuver didn't just block him from stealing my money. It actively triggered the immediate, irreversible liquidation of everything he actually owned. By Tuesday morning, Daniel's business partners, realizing they were facing federal indictments for bank fraud, turned state's evidence in a desperate bid to save themselves. Throwing Daniel under the bus, the banks froze all of Daniel's personal accounts. Federal marshals arrived at the Vanguard Logistics headquarters, changing the locks on the doors and seizing his warehouses. He didn't just fail to steal my empire. By reaching his greedy hand into the fire to take what was mine, he had legally, systematically, and permanently detonated his own. 4 days into my agonizing recovery, as a nurse was carefully changing the sterile dressings on my shoulder, a heavily guarded armed courier arrived at my hospital room. He bypassed the front desk, flanked by hospital security, and handed Dr. Ortiz a thick, heavily sealed, red-stamped dossier from the district attorney's office. Lena signed for it and handed it to me. I sliced the seal open with a plastic knife from my lunch tray. Inside was a formal drafted plea deal. Daniel, sitting in a cold county jail cell, stripped of his bespoke suits, his wealth and his arrogance, was breaking under the pressure, faced with decades in federal prison for the financial fraud and state prison for the assault cover-up. He had desperately offered the state a trade. He was willing to turn state's evidence against his own mother. He was offering to testify under oath that Vivian had premeditated the boiling oil attack to force my compliance with further financial demands, throwing the woman who had birthed him and enabled him entirely to the wolves in exchange for a reduced sentence. But because the plea deal involved a severe domestic violence charge, the district attorney needed my formal sign-off as the primary victim to proceed with the ultimate, Oedipal betrayal. I looked at the document, a slow, dark smile spreading across my face. The endgame had arrived. I stared at the thick legal parchment of the plea deal resting on my lap, the harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital room illuminating the absolute, staggering cowardice of the man I had married. Daniel was offering to serve as the prosecution's star witness. He was promising to swear under oath, before a judge and jury, that Vivian had plotted the attack. He was willing to detail how she boiled the oil, how she waited for the perfect moment, all to brutally enforce her dominance over me. He was selling the mother who had worshipped him, the mother who had burned me to protect his ego, to save his own miserable skin from a maximum security sentence. It was the ultimate pathetic act of a narcissist. When faced with the loss of their own comfort, they will feed anyone to the fire. I picked up a pen from the bedside table. I held it over the signature line. Then I put the pen down. A simple signature was too easy. It didn't extract the toll required for 3 years of psychological torture and a lifetime of physical scars. "Lena," I said, looking up at my friend who was watching me closely. "Tell Julian to arrange a secure video deposition with the district attorney and Daniel's defense counsel. Tell them I refuse to sign the deal unless I speak to my husband directly. Have them set it up for $3 p.m. today." 5 hours later, the tablet was propped up on my overbed table. The screen was split into 3 feeds. The top left showed the stern, unamused face of the district attorney. The top right showed Julian Vance, representing my interests. The main feed at the bottom showed a stark, gray, cinder-block interrogation room in the county jail. Daniel sat at a metal table, handcuffed to a heavy steel ring bolted to the surface. He looked entirely hollowed out. The perfectly coiffed hair was greasy and flat. The arrogant, untouchable spark in his eyes had been completely extinguished, replaced by the frantic, wide-eyed terror of a trapped animal. He was wearing an oversized, bright orange county jumpsuit that swallowed his frame. His public defender sat silently next to him. "Clara!" Daniel gasped the moment my face appeared on the screen. He leaned forward, straining against the handcuffs, his voice cracking with a pathetic, desperate whine. "Clara, please." "Oh God, I'm so sorry. Please, just sign the paper. I'll give you whatever you want. I'll sign the house over. I'll give you my shares in the company. Just sign the deal. I can't survive in federal prison. Please, Clara, I'm begging you." I watched him weep. I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical detachment. "You don't have anything left to give me, Daniel," I said. My voice echoed coldly through the laptop speakers in the interrogation room, hard and unyielding. "Your company is liquidated. The bank seized your house yesterday morning. Your accounts are frozen. You are entirely bankrupt. You bring absolutely nothing to this negotiation table." Daniel's jaw dropped. The realization that his financial empire was gone, that I had already stripped him bare while lying in a hospital bed, hit him with the force of a physical blow. He slumped back in his metal chair, a low moan escaping his lips. "However," I continued, leaning slightly closer to the camera, ensuring he saw the bandages wrapping my neck and shoulder, "I will sign the district attorney's recommendation. But I am adding 2 non-negotiable conditions." The DA leaned forward on his feed. "We are listening, Ms. Vance." "First," I stated, staring dead into Daniel's weeping eyes, "you will sign a complete, uncontested divorce decree today. You will formally forfeit any and all claims to marital assets, alimony, or spousal support. You will admit that you breached the marriage contract through criminal enterprise." Daniel nodded frantically, his head bobbing up and down. Yes, I'll sign it, anything." "Second," I said, dropping my voice to a lethal, quiet whisper, "your testimony against Vivian will not be sealed. You will not hide behind a closed courtroom. You will confess, on the public record in open court, to the attempted financial fraud, your complicity in the assault, and your attempt to cover it up. You will publicly admit that you are a thief, a coward, and a fraud." Daniel swallowed hard. The remaining color drained from his face, leaving him chalk white. Tears of pure, unadulterated terror spilled down his cheeks. He knew exactly what I was doing. Testifying publicly, admitting to defrauding major banks and allowing his wife to be tortured, would destroy any microscopic shred of his reputation forever. He would never be able to work in the corporate sector again. He would be a pariah, universally despised. But the alternative was a cage surrounded by men who would show a wealthy, arrogant fraudster no mercy. With a violently trembling hand, Daniel reached out. The public defender slid the amended plea agreement across the metal table. Daniel picked up the cheap plastic pen provided by the jail and signed his name, legally, permanently signing away his entire existence, his reputation, and his mother. As the deposition ended and the screen went black, sealing Daniel's fate, I let out a long, slow breath. The war was won. The door to my hospital room opened. Dr. Ortiz walked in to check my bandages, but her face was grave, her jaw tight with adrenaline. "The skin grafts are holding beautifully." "Clara," Lena said softly, checking the monitors. She paused, looking down at me. "But the police liaison just called the front desk. Vivian found out about Daniel's plea deal." I frowned, pushing myself up slightly. "How?" Her defense attorney informed her in the county holding facility that her son was the prosecution's star witness, Lena explained. When she realized Daniel had sold her out to save himself, she lost her mind. In a blind, hysterical rage, she tried to physically attack a corrections officer. Lena paused, a grim, dark irony settling into her eyes. The stress of the betrayal was too much. Vivian suffered a massive, catastrophic cardiac event in the cell block. She's alive, but barely. She's being transported to the cardiac intensive care unit of this very hospital right now, under armed guard. The fallout over the next 12 months was a masterpiece of karmic, inescapable implosion. The universe possesses a ruthless, beautiful mechanism for balancing the scales when abusers are finally dragged into the light. Vivian survived her massive heart attack, but the damage to her myocardium was severe. She was left permanently weakened, confined to a wheelchair, a frail shadow of the sadistic matriarch who had terrorized my kitchen. But her physical weakness offered her no reprieve from the justice system. 6 months after the attack, she sat in a sterile courtroom, clutching a shawl around her trembling shoulders. She was forced to sit and listen as the prosecution played the high-definition audio of her pouring the boiling oil. She was forced to watch as her own beloved son, Daniel, took the witness stand. Daniel, wearing a cheap suit provided by his public defender, kept his head down. He refused to look at his mother. Under oath, he detailed her obsessive need for control, her premeditation of the attack, and her historical cruelty. Listening to her golden child betray her on the public record completely broke Vivian's mind. She wept hysterically in the courtroom, cursing his name, realizing that the monster she had raised had ultimately devoured her. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Vivian was found guilty of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon and sentenced to 15 years in a state penitentiary. Given her failing health, it was a death sentence. She was doomed to die in a concrete cell entirely, irrevocably abandoned by the boy she thought she controlled. Daniel, despite his cowardice and his plea deal, could not escape the federal prosecutors. The state dropped the accessory to assault charges in exchange for his testimony, but the federal government is not so forgiving when it comes to defrauding major financial institutions. The wire fraud, the forged documents, and the embezzlement charges carried a mandatory minimum. Daniel was sentenced to 8 years in a federal correctional facility. He was stripped of his bespoke Tom Ford suits, his luxury cars, and his arrogant swagger. He was locked in a 6x8 cell with nothing to keep him company but the agonizing, inescapable memory of the multi-million-dollar empire he had held in his hands, only to arrogantly throw it into the fire. He filed for bankruptcy from prison, entirely destitute. My healing, however, was a grueling, agonizing journey. The skin grafts on my left shoulder, my collarbone, and my back required multiple surgeries. They left thick, jagged, raised pink scars that stretched across my skin like a topographical map of my survival. For months, the physical therapy was a daily torture. It hurt to breathe, to stretch, to lift my arm. But the physical pain was a profound, cleansing fire compared to the suffocating, psychological nightmare I had endured in that marriage for 3 years. Every pulse of pain in my shoulder was a reminder that I was alive, that I was free, and that I had won. When I was finally discharged, I returned to the custom-built, modern estate I owned outside the city. Before I arrived, I had Julian hire a team to strip the house bare. They sold every piece of furniture Daniel had purchased, repainted every wall Vivian had touched, and burned the bedding. Walking through the front doors, the house smelled of fresh paint and ozone. The silence in the massive, echoing rooms wasn't lonely. It was absolute, impenetrable, glorious safety. I didn't retreat from the world. I shed the identity of the clumsy, submissive housewife like a snake shedding dead skin. I returned to my legal roots, but with a new, fierce, unyielding purpose. I took executive control of my father's investment firm, restructuring the entire organization. I carved out a massive, heavily funded philanthropic wing, I hired a team of elite fraud attorneys, forensic accountants, and private security contractors. Our sole mission was providing immediate, pro bono legal and financial extraction services for women trapped in domestic abuse, situations where financial control was the primary weapon of the abuser. We found hidden assets, froze accounts, secured emergency housing, and destroyed the men who thought money made them untouchable. I became a phantom in the corporate world, a rumor among white-collar criminals, a woman who could bankrupt you before you even knew you were under investigation. My life had become a beautiful, fiercely protected sanctuary. I had built an impenetrable fortress around my peace. But 5 years later, the universe demanded one final, silent confrontation to truly close the ledger. The freezing, relentless November rain slicked the gray pavement outside the towering federal courthouse in downtown Chicago. I had just spent the last 3 hours inside, systematically destroying a corrupt hedge fund manager in front of a federal judge, securing a massive, life-changing financial victory and a permanent restraining order for a pro bono client who had been terrorized by him for a decade. The adrenaline of the courtroom was slowly fading, replaced by a deep, satisfying exhaustion. I stood beneath the grand, concrete awning of the courthouse steps, pulling my heavy, camel hair cashmere coat tighter around my shoulders, watching the rain bounce off the street as I waited for my driver to pull the town car around. That was when I saw him. Daniel was standing 30 feet away, near the curb, working alongside a massive, idling municipal trash truck. He had been released from federal prison a few months prior on early parole due to overcrowding, but his life was over. Burdened by massive, insurmountable court-ordered restitution to the banks, and carrying a federal felony conviction for fraud, he was entirely unemployable in the corporate sector. He was wearing a cheap, oversized, soaking wet neon orange sanitation uniform. He was wrestling a heavy, overflowing public trash bin toward the hydraulic lift on the back of the truck, his shoulders hunched painfully against the bitter, freezing rain. He looked 15 years older. His hair was thinning, plastered to his skull by the rain. His face was gaunt, unshaven, and deeply lined. The arrogant, untouchable spark that used to dance in his eyes, the spark that believed he was inherently superior to everyone around him, had been completely, brutally extinguished. It was replaced by the hollow, haunted, dead stare of a man utterly crushed under the weight of his own consequences. He turned his head to wipe the rain from his eyes. He saw me. Daniel froze. The heavy trash bin slipped from his grasp, crashing onto the wet pavement. A mixture of profound, agonizing shame and desperate, pathetic, starving longing washed over his pale face. He was looking at the woman he had tortured, standing on the steps of the courthouse, radiating wealth, power, and absolute untouchability. He took a hesitant, trembling half-step forward, leaving the shelter of the truck. His hand raised slightly, reaching out across the distance. He opened his mouth, the rain hitting his face, preparing to speak, to beg, to apologize, to try and summon the ghost of a wife who had burned to ash 5 years ago. A year ago, I might have felt the urge to destroy him with a word. I might have felt a twisted sense of pity or a flash of blinding rage. Today, looking at the soaking wet, broken man shivering on the curb, I felt absolutely nothing. He was a ghost. He was an unpleasant memory haunting a life I no longer occupied. He was a piece of trash on the sidewalk, entirely irrelevant to the trajectory of my universe. I didn't sneer. I didn't smile. I didn't even acknowledge his existence with a change in my expression. I simply reached up with a manicured hand and adjusted the collar of my heavy cashmere coat. As I pulled the lapel aside, the silk scarf at my neck slipped just a fraction of an inch, revealing the edge of the thick, jagged, raised pink burn scar that stretched across my collarbone. I didn't hide it. I wore it like titanium armor. I let him see exactly what he had created and exactly what had destroyed him. My black town car pulled smoothly up to the curb, the tires hissing on the wet pavement, blocking him from my sight. My driver opened the rear door. I turned my head and stepped into the warm, rich leather interior of the waiting car, the heavy door thudding shut, completely sealing out the cold, the rain, and the past, as the luxury vehicle pulled smoothly away from the courthouse, leaving Daniel standing in the freezing rain to pick up the garbage he had dropped. I leaned back against the plush headrest and looked out the tinted window at the blurring, beautiful city lights. He had told the doctor I was clumsy. He was right. I had stumbled blindly and foolishly into a family of monsters. I had fallen into a trap, but I realized then, feeling the smooth rhythm of the car and the quiet strength in my scarred shoulder, that the absolute most dangerous thing you can possibly do is push a clumsy woman into a fire. Because when she finally stands back up, forged in the flames you built, she knows exactly how to burn your entire world to the ground without even breaking a sweat. If you want more stories, please like this video and subscribe the channel.